Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming to join us for the launch of the 2016 World Monuments Watch. And it's a great pleasure always to do this in front of a group of journalists because the message of the watch is getting the message out and engaging the public with the sites that we're concerned about through this program. And you are a very important part of it. So thank you for coming and participating and writing something about the sites on the World Monuments Watch list. 2016 is a milestone for the World Monuments Watch because it represents the 20th anniversary of this program. And so in the process of preparing this year's list, we also conducted an evaluation of the program and the impact that it's had over the last 20 years. And I'm going to start the presentation today by reviewing some of the things that we found out through both an internal and an external evaluation of the World Monuments Watch. To date, including the sites on the 2016 list, we have included 790 discrete sites on the World Monuments Watch located in 135 countries around the world, which I think shows strongly the great penetration that this program has had and the embrace that experts and preservationists around the world have taken to help call their sites and their issues and needs to broad public attention. Over that time, WMF has contributed about $100 million, over $100 million in fact, directly to sites on the watch list to improve their state of conservation. And of that money, $16.5 million has come from our founding sponsor, American Express, which really was a true partner from day one of the conception of the program. And we're so happy to still have them on board, and they'll be speaking in just a few minutes. We've kept track, to the extent that we can, of money that came into the sites as a result of the watch through partners or through the advocacy action that the watch is supposed to stimulate. And we can count $245 million in investments from others to the same sites during the same time as they were included on the watch. And so that 2.5 leverage factor is something we look for in at least 2-to-1 leverage in almost everything we do at the World Monuments Fund. And so we're very happy to see it replicated here in this program. This graph shows you the kinds of sites that have been included on the watch by site type. As you can see, there's a very broad range of virtually any kind of building that's in public use has been included on the World Monuments Watch. But I think it's quite interesting that almost half of the sites are either religious or archaeological. And each of these site types points to a very specific kind of issue. And this is the other illuminating thing that we've learned from the World Monuments Watch, how to deal with a range of issues and a range of different kinds of threats. And I'll be talking about that a little bit later. And then you'll see the next large group of 20% consists of either urban or cultural landscapes, indicating a problem that has to do with changes in the way people live, population growth in cities, abandonment of agricultural areas, and encroachment caused by development. This chart depicts the major threats to the sites. I hope you can all read what the charts say in the back, but these are also included in a little booklet that you will have received, I hope, in your materials that summarizes the success of the watch over 20 years. It was quite surprising to me to learn that 63% of the sites seem to be suffering primarily from a lack of resources. And that means both money and, in certain circumstances, technical resources to understand what needs to be done and be able to execute that. And then the next cause is, of course, development pressure, suggesting that the heritage field and the concerns, and particularly if you combine that with overwhelming tourism, which is a form of development pressure. We see more than 20% of the sites. It's an issue about not having the needs of the preservation field present at the planning table when certain kinds of public decisions are made. But the other surprise to me was that only a very small number of the sites, around 15%, are impacted by things that you could say are completely beyond our control, like natural catastrophes, war, and looting. And even though the challenges that are presented on those occasions are much greater than those that are endemic to the system, I think what this shows us is a picture that with a continued concerted effort, we can change for the better. And this is, last but not least, our success ratio chart, which shows an overwhelming positive change as a result of this program. About 2/5 of the sites that have been included on the watch have received direct financial support from WMF. And almost as many have received either financial support or the kind of public decision solutions that were needed in order to take them out of danger. So we're looking at almost 80% success ratio, which we think is an unqualified success. Only about 2% of the sites actually further deteriorated after watch listing, and a few of them have been spectacularly lost, generally to demolition, and that often involves modern buildings, and that's one of the patterns that we've discovered. Our goal, of course, is to get that 13% that are showing no progress into one of those green categories, and that's going to involve even more outreach and more financial support. WMF has put some processes in place already to eliminate the status unknown category from this chart in the future by improving our capacity to monitor in an ongoing fashion the sites on the watch. We've also initiated some other complementary programs that help us to provide some assistance to every site on the watch list. One is the introduction of something that's been very successful over the last few years called World Monuments Watch Day, where every site is encouraged to organize an event that celebrates their watch site in a local context. It can be a lecture, it can be something oriented toward a youth audience or children, it can be a bicycle rally. I attended a bicycle rally in Mexico City that was one of the memorable events of my life. Thousands of people turned out for that. And every nominator now has to tell us what they intend to do on their watch day. And they receive a very small amount of financial support from us to allow them to organize it and promote it. And that's had a huge impact on a local level. We also provide technical assistance wherever we can to help the nominators solve their problems. And many of our WMF staff members here are and will be actively involved with the new watch sites as this process goes forward. So we usually start this presentation by making a reference to 2 or 3 sites that we can call unqualified success stories from the previous round. And so I'm going to quickly run through those today. The cloisters and palisades were listed on the 2014 list because of the impact on this pristine viewshed that would have been impacted by the construction of a high-rise building, the proposed headquarters of the LG Electronics USA company. And thanks to a coalition of environmental organizations with our advocacy outreach, the town of Inglewood Cliffs was brought around to realize that this was not going to have a positive impact on the political future of the mayor. And together, everyone agreed to try to persuade LG to redesign their factory plant and headquarters, which they've done. So the Palisades will remain a pristine viewshed for New York City. And we thought winning an advocacy battle like that was a long shot, but it's something that we're really very excited about. Another success story involves these tiny vernacular churches that are at the core of community life throughout central Romania, uh, which were included on the previous watch. They were nominated by a very vigorous local advocacy group in Romania called Pro Patrimonio. And with very, very modest financial support from WMF, they were able to assemble a big group of volunteers and community members in order to save this tiny church in the town of Ursi, Romania. And a very well-known Romanian violinist has taken this up as his cause and has organized charity concerts all over the world for the sake of these wooden churches. So it's given them the visibility and public awareness that they need in order to continue their program. So it's wonderful to see this little church coming back together. The paintings on the interior are now being restored in the National Museum of Romania and will return to site this summer. And this is the ancient irrigated terraces of Batir in the Palestinian territories, a site that's been had agricultural use over millennia. It was being threatened by the expansion of Israeli settlements and by the creation of a wall that would have walled off the settlements from the Palestinian territories. Strenuous advocacy as well as World Heritage listing by UNESCO made a difference for this site, and the Israeli Supreme Court ruled against the continued building of the wall in January of this year. The site is still being monitored by UNESCO in relation to other forms of change or encroachment that could compromise this landscape, but for the purposes of why it was included on the watch, it was an unmitigated success. So now I'm going to turn the program over to Tim McClyman, our partner in all of this, to say a few words about American Express. He's the president of the American Express Foundation, about their sponsorship.
Thank you very much, Bonnie, and thank you, Bonnie, for your heroic efforts in saving some of the world's most valued cultural sites over the past 30 years. So thank you. As Bonnie mentioned, as the founding sponsor of the World Monuments Fund in 1995, American Express has been unwavering in our support of the watch and the fund, as well as the organization's mission to protect our most treasured landmarks around the globe. To date, as Bonnie mentioned, we've contributed more than $16 million to help preserve about 160 heritage sites in 70 countries from the watch list. Historic preservation has long been a hallmark of American Express's involvement in the community. We recognize the importance of cultural sites and monuments as symbols of national and local identity, and the role that their preservation can play in attracting visitors and in revitalizing neighborhoods. For the past 3 watch cycles, I've joined Bonnie at this announcement, and while I'm sometimes frustrated with seeing the same trends over and over again and the same patterns of behavior in some local communities, I'm also heartened by the fact that inclusion on the watch list is really a call to action to the communities and is really the first step in the potential rehabilitation and preservation of these sites. Being named to the watch is a beacon of hope that these sites will survive for future generations, for us all to enjoy and reflect upon. And as you've just seen, the World Monuments Fund does a terrific job and has a terrific track record at helping to preserve and restore these important sites around the world. Together with an engaged community, civic and government support, and the help of preservationists, we have and we will continue to revitalize historic sites affected by environmental disasters, development pressures, and neglect. Behind me here on the screen are just some before and after shots of that illustrate the impact that we've had on preserving some of these world treasures. I think that we can reverse the damage done and create sustainable futures for these sites. And as I said, the watch list is a critical first step in this effort. It's been said that conservation is an investment in the future. It's an investment we believe is worth making. We will be reviewing the 2016 watch list and carefully trying to determine which sites we would like to support with some of our grant making going forward. So we appreciate your joining us today and partnering with us to spread the message about the important contributions that we can make toward the preservation and sustainability of a few of the world's most special places. Thank you very much.
So now it's time to see what we've got on the 2016 watch list. The list includes 50 sites in 36 countries that are at risk from the forces of nature and the impact of social, political, and economic change. As Tim has alluded to, these sites are emblematic of preservation issues that are prevalent all over the world, from conflict to development pressures and natural disasters to lack of resources. And each site represents a high moment of culture, and our local concern as well as worldwide concern will strengthen our ability to save them. I'm going to approach the presentation by theme, and you'll see that there are a few sites portrayed that depict the theme, and then I'm going to talk about one site in relation to each of these themes. So here we go. Obviously, the syndrome that's been in the news over recent months and even years now is the conflict that's taking place throughout the world and causing both secondary and intentional destruction to cultural heritage. The two sites on the World Monuments Watch list that are victims of conflict are not so much sites that have been directly impacted by war and violence as they are sites that are impacted by the destabilization that these events have caused around the world. The site of Amity in Iraq is, as you can see, a densely inhabited hill town in the Kurdistan territories that has had its urban pattern and traditions established for millennia. It is being impacted by the influx of refugees into the area and the pressure that brings for new building. So it needs planning and rules put in place immediately, and whatever safeguards are possible in order to prevent dramatic change from happening here. And on the right, Abu Sir el-Malak is an ancient archaeological site in Egypt, which is in fact a palimpsest of history over 2,700 years since it was first occupied in the Bronze Age. You can see this is a site that has been so heavily looted that it can no longer be considered an archaeological site. All the history of the habitation of this place has been compromised. And so the reason for listing it is that it is emblematic of so many places in the region that have had this kind of negative impact, that we need collectively as a profession to think about what we're going to do going forward to handle these places in the future, and how to what extent they can be stabilized and consolidated, to what extent the community can still learn from the history that was once a part of the place. And we also want to raise awareness of the damage that is being caused by looting and the worldwide international traffic in antiquities. Many experts in this field feel that the money that's being made through looting is feeding terrorism. So we felt that this was an important issue to highlight, even though we don't think there's anything to do to save the site. And the 50th site on our list is named Unnamed Monument. and I'm going to read you our entry on this so that I don't get it wrong. It's listed in recognition of the deliberate and calculated damage to thousands of cultural heritage sites in many areas of political and social instability. There are simply too many sites at risk to be included individually on the watch, and no immediate hope for resolution. The unnamed monument seeks to shift the focus to local populations who are losing their cultural heritage and history, and away from our own outrage, which plays to the propaganda of those who are perpetrating this damage. I think many of us in this field are worried about promoting this concern very much each time one of these atrocities occurs. So this is our effort to address the issue in a more general way. Natural catastrophe and climate is always with us, but accelerating as a result of climate change. Here are two of the sites that have been impacted by these kinds of events in recent months. A church in Peru in the neighborhood of Barranco, which was badly damaged as a result of an earthquake, further compromised by storms as a result of change of climate patterns, which is being highlighted in an effort to bring it back as a centerpiece of this now very attractive, trendy community along the Lima, Peru oceanfront. And the portrayed site for this issue is the Nepal cultural heritage sites that were impacted by the earthquake that occurred last April. Earthquakes are fairly common to this part of the world, and many of these buildings have been through multiple earthquakes over their lifetime. Most of the heritage sites came through the earthquake relatively well, but these events always generate a public perception that old buildings have to be torn down and replaced with new buildings in order to prevent these earthquake damage. In the future, we don't support that point of view, and we're working actively with the Kathmandu Valley Heritage Trust to restore important historic buildings, which are really at the centerpiece of the cultural life of Kathmandu and other cities in the high Himalayas of Nepal. As we saw in the slide at the beginning, a lack of investment in resources is the biggest challenge that we face. So I'm going to be talking about 5 different sites very quickly that all are facing this challenge, but in slightly different ways. The Mission San Javier del Bac, known as the White Dove of the Desert in Arizona, is the most significant of the New Spain churches in the United States. It's a masonry church. Many of the religious buildings in this area are made of adobe, but over a course of time, over a long time, the preservation needs of this church have been either neglected or badly addressed through restoration treatment. And in spite of the fact that there's a very active congregation and a patronato behind the preservation of the church, they feel they need a more comprehensive campaign now and to step up efforts that have been going on for years and years in order to bring this to a stabilized condition. So we're backing both San Javier del Bac and another important Spanish colonial church in New Mexico, San Esteban del Rey, which is on the Acoma Pueblo, which we've had a lot of experience with, in order to try and really push through both of these important buildings to the point that they can be stabilized and preserved. In Cuba, we have 3 sites on the current list, but I think this one is particularly attractive. The colonial churches of Santiago de Cuba on the north coast of the country, a collection of some of the most important churches in the country, and a group of sites that could benefit the local community substantially through a restoration effort that would then help support tourism to that part of Cuba. The Viborg Historic Center in Russia, in Karelia, near the Finnish border, is an important historic town and a place where we have a certain watch history because of the fact that the Viipuri Library by Alvar Aalto was on an early watch list and is now one of our great success stories. It's been completely restored by a local advocacy group and won the World Monuments Fund Knoll Modernism Prize this year. But there's much more to Viborg than we realized, and many of these historic buildings are abandoned, leaving them prey for new development. So this spans the resources, the development, the awareness categories. We're advocating for better planning and better protection for the historic center of the city. In Mexico City, we have one of the largest and most important ecological open areas of green spaces anywhere, comparable to our Central Park, if not bigger, which is a place of recreation for something like 15 million people a year. The needs of to maintain the integrity of the park have been neglected. A local advocacy group has been formed, and little by little, they've been restoring different parts of the park. They're looking for wider recognition through the watch, and also for the possibility of designing and opening up new open spaces in order to accommodate the needs and demands. And this amazing pile is one of it's said to be the biggest of the Palladian houses of England, and certainly one of the most important ones, which has had a very checkered history since World War II and is now considered to be the most important historic building at risk in the UK today. It's called Wentworth Woodhouse. It's an architectural masterpiece on a colossal scale, the former seat of a great political dynasty and once the home of a prime minister. It was taken over for military intelligence during World War II, as were many of the country houses of England, or as hospitals and so forth. But this house never recovered. It was the victim of a national coal shortage after the war. Coal had been the source of the wealth of the aristocratic family that owned this house and built it. But coal mining, in particular, very abusive strip mining right up to the front door of the house, completely compromised the 80-acre park. And the house went into a kind of receivership. Right now, it's privately owned, and there is a trust that's just been established with the cooperation of the owner in order to bring it back into the public domain. A very interesting and I think valuable multiple use plan to allow this to be used for all kinds of uses, including residence and commercial use, rather than trying to just restore it as an historic house museum, is underway, and we're supporting the goal of preserving Wentworth Woodhouse. Development pressure, as you know, is our next big challenge, and I've selected 3 sites to highlight this. I'm going to be talking in just a minute a little more about Petra. On the left, in the center, you see El Vedado, a neighborhood of Havana, which is home to an assortment of 19th century and 20th century architecture. It's a neighborhood that designed landscape or cityscape that was developed in the middle of the 19th century and became the most desirable place in Havana to live up until the Castro era. Probably a lot of Cuban expats who live in Miami once lived in El Vedado, so it's difficult to know precisely what will happen as changes begin to occur in the city, but that's the source of our concern, to retain the integrity and scale of this neighborhood and the viability of current uses as things go forward. And on the right, the last stretch of open landscape on the Mediterranean in Beirut, which has now fallen prey to private investment. And this is a piece of land that was used for public recreation as well as religious purposes for hundreds and hundreds of years. Again, local advocates seeking our help to bring attention to the idea of keeping it as public domain. Petra has been on the World Monuments Watch numerous times, 1996, 98, 2000, and 2002. So why is it coming back? In part because the problems here are so severe and so not exactly insurmountable, but chronic. One is the collapse of sections of the site as a result of fissures in the rock, which have never been fully mapped and understood, so that a preventative plan would be in order. Another is the traditional life that is lived in and around the site by Bedouins who have their small villages within Petra, and the lack of any real structuring of the way that life can integrate with the monuments without causing damage. And then thirdly, the inability or lack of focus up until now on management of tourism, both in the town and in the site itself and in the town that's developed in the valley called Wadi Musa, where you access Petra. There are physical dangers that have to do with flash flooding, but the biggest problem is really how the community fails to integrate with the tourism to the site. And this is what the Petra National Trust is trying to address now through educational programs, engaging local people in the community, trying to bring local youth into a form of sympathy with the site and pride in order, and engage them economically in order that they would become the custodians of the future. This theme, which we call loss of cultural traditions, is a kind of nuanced issue and threat, because it's not usually about the fact that sites are immediately at risk of loss, as that they are transitioning into a form of new life that is not consistent with that of the past and with local traditions that have existed and with oral traditions that are associated with the place. There are two sites to highlight this topic. On the right, the Moseley Road Baths in Birmingham, England, which is a widely used facility for a very diverse community. I guess we're all familiar with discussions about the swimming pools in New York and that have had their ups and downs over time, and this is a very similar kind of issue. This is charted to be closed in 2016, and that's why it's being included on the watch. And then on the right, a vernacular community and the largest concentration of pre-1850 architecture in the heart of Cape Town, South Africa. Obviously a colorful place where a colorful local tradition has thrived. This is falling victim to change and the pressure of rezoning that has resulted in the conversion of many of these houses into boutique hotels, in the change from a pedestrian-based local life to automobile-based, the encroachment of office towers, the erosion of the original fabric as a result of the loss of skills to maintain these houses. And so this is a fairly endemic kind of urban problem in many historic cities around the world. And BOCAP, I think, is a particularly interesting example of how to manage this change. The saddest theme of the watch is the fact that many of the sites that we are trying to highlight are not recognized for their importance. And so I've chosen two examples. This site called the Kwa Ruins in Tanzania is one of the repositories of Swahili culture. We've had dealings with another site very nearby called Kilwa, where we've been able to bring about a very, very successful program to turn around the site and focus the local community on its preservation. Kilwa is a World Heritage Site. Kua is much less well known, and it's suffering from both looting and natural encroachment. And on the right, a kind of astonishing Atlantis of the southern Peloponnese called Pavlopetri, which is the oldest submerged city in the world from Minoan times, which was discovered, I think, in the 1970s. And since that time has not really received the level of protection that would be necessary in order to preserve it as an underwater archaeological site. The threat is large ships that use the same harbor and discharge of water, polluted water into the harbor, so there's water pollution, combined with the fact that small boats are allowed to access this area, which disturbs the archaeological remains. So the goal of this entry is to set up a barrier zone that will protect the site and try to clean up the harbor and prevent the level of pollution that's made possible with the shipping. And so in addition to these themes of threats, we have themes of affinities that have revealed themselves over the course of the watch. And there's been a particular incidence of 20th-century sites that are more subject than other kinds of sites to demolition because there has not been the kind of planning and protection for them that historic heritage provides and typically gets under government regimes. We've got several examples. This is the Shulkov Tower in the heart of Moscow. It's an engineering marvel that is in a bad state of deterioration, but because of the pressures on land values, there was a proposal recently to dismantle it and move it someplace else. So the watch listing is to encourage protection of the tower, preservation in integrity in its original place. In the middle, an extraordinary building by a Cambodian architect who is one of the luminaries of the mid-modern period, Van Mullivan, his buildings really occupy a period that's a very important period in Cambodian history as it achieved independence in the 1950s and before the decimation of the Khmer Rouge in the 1970s. The current government of Cambodia takes no interest in these buildings, and they take no interest in the architect, Van Mullivan, who's now a very senior member of the worldwide architecture constellation. And even though this is actively used by a local community for recreation, it is being superseded by a new stadium. There are areas of the complex that have already been sold off for development, and there's concern that demolition is down the road. So we are advocating for the National Sports Complex and for all of the work of this extraordinary architect. And then in the town of Salvador de Bahia in Brazil, there's a very interesting area that was a visionary scheme of an Italian architect, Lino Bobardi, called Ladera de Misericordia. This building on the left is the only surviving building of what was once a very popular ensemble of restaurants and shops and art galleries that she designed. And even though Salvador has a thriving urban center historic preservation movement, this neighborhood on the outskirts of the central part of town, the buildings in it are very much at risk. And so there you have our group of 20th century sites. And then finally, places, sites of conscience. The watch has had its share of concentration camps, gulags, prisons, and the like, and we have a couple to share with you today. The World War II concentration camps of Italy, which of which there are 12 that survive and are virtually unknown to the Italian public and unprotected. And then this terrifying place called Spac in Albania, which was built only in the 1960s, and where many of the country's luminaries and famous intellectuals were incarcerated and forced to work in mines. This is a mining facility. And as challenging as it would appear to be to preserve this place, which is so much in the middle of nowhere that they didn't even need to fence it, there was really no way to escape from Spac. There are advocates who would like to preserve it as a memory of this moment in time and as a place of conscience. So that's just a few of the 50 sites that are in your World Monuments Watch package. Each and every one of them has its own story, and each and every one of them needs its own strategy and its own resources in order to be saved. So I invite you to learn about them by visiting our website and by reviewing the materials that we've given you. I'm going to turn the program over now to Lisa Ackerman, who will lead a question and answer session and introduce a couple of our nominators who are with us today.
Thank you, Bonnie. I first want to thank everybody for coming, and once again thank American Express for their unwavering support, but also to make a few comments about how the watch comes together, since that's a frequent question. So hundreds of people nominate each round. We actually have a year-long process of review, and virtually every staff member at WMF, both here and abroad, participates. So really 50 World Monuments Fund personnel participate. And then we work very closely with the International Council of Monuments and Sites, who serve as external reviewers. And in the summer, in July, we had a sort of all-staff jamboree for a week, reviewing the sites and organizing them into sort of staff suggestions for what should be on the watch and what shouldn't. And because you can't trust staff not to be partisan about their favorite places, we always convene an external panel that makes the final decisions. And the external panel are people with very broad knowledge in the cultural field. And in this round, we had people who were urban planners and archaeologists and anthropologists, conservation architects, conservation scientists, and people really with leadership roles in UNESCO and other bodies. So it's an illustrious panel, and we're grateful for their help with each round. And then I would like to especially note a few staff members, because the incredible effort to bring this together through the website and the materials and the presentation today would not be possible without our communications director, Daniela Stieg, our art director, Ken Faisal, our archivist, Margot Note, our web person, Lissa Kiernan, and then the incredible program staff, in this instance, led by a core team of people really dedicated to the watch, Yanis Avramidis, Stephanie Ortiz, and Catherine Doyle. So many more people participated, but I wanted to take a moment to note their help. And then several of staff members and my colleagues are here who can also answer questions. We do have two nominators with us. Kathmandu Valley Preservation Trust is represented by Susanna Robinson here in the audience today, and Jorge Hernandez, who nominated the churches in Santiago de Cuba, is with us. So if there are questions about those sites, I will turn them over to them. So with that, if there are any questions, I'm happy to answer them or turn it over to my colleagues. Sorry, I'm with the light. I see two hands going up, but I can't quite see you. Okay. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Lucy Westcott. I'm with Newsweek magazine. I'm wondering if this year is the first year you've had the unnamed monument, and am I right in thinking that among those unnamed monuments are monuments that have been destroyed by ISIS or Daesh?
Yes, indeed. In the watch for a number of years, we've called out the entire country of Iraq in previous watch cycles, the entire country of Syria, and the entire country of Mali. We felt this time that the nominations were complex, having to do with conflict zones, but we also felt the problem rises so much above any one monument As we were finalizing the watch list, very regrettably, 2 sites in Palmyra were destroyed, and I think that galvanized our thinking that it's not any one monument or any one country. We're really seeing an assault on cultural heritage that's both at an unprecedented level and obviously great media coverage in the world in which we live today. And the unnamed monument was really an attempt, as Bonnie read from our entry, to not focus on any one country, but really have a call to arms that, as UNESCO and ICOMOS and other national and international bodies have said, we really need collectively to figure out a way to better protect these heritage sites, which are erasing memory and destroying communities as much as they are destroying any one specific place. Yes?
Yes, are there any on-site volunteer opportunities for people who are interested in being involved in preservation? My only example would be Earthwatch, where you go out with a scientist and help. But are there things that people can do to volunteer on-site to make this happen?
Well, every one of the watch sites has a nominator behind it, which is often a local advocacy group. And so World Monuments Fund is not always able to offer volunteer opportunities, but any one of these individual sites often has very robust volunteer activities.
Wonderful, thank you.
Sure. Yes?
How does MFT monitor the destruction of sites in Syria like Palmyra? You said that you don't want to focus on one country, but because there is sort of an erasure of history that's happening there, how important is it for MFT to monitor what's happening there, and what sort of outreach do you do? Do you try to reach out to the government in Damascus? Do you try to reach out to the Russian government?
I think as a general principle, World Monuments Fund is an independent, US-based nonprofit. So our goal from 1965 to today has always been to raise the consciousness about places and to work with local governments and local advocacy agencies and local preservation entities to the extent possible. In the case of, say, Iraq, once armed conflict ended in the mid-2000s, we were able to work very closely with the Iraq State Board of Antiquities and Heritage, and we've worked at Babylon on site steadily since 2009, and our work continues there today. So when there is not peril to people who might work on sites, we certainly find ways to work. In Syria, I think all we can do really, like everybody else in the world, is watch and worry. The Director General of Antiquities and Museums in Syria has been an incredible hero. I think everybody would agree that his efforts to keep his staff together and to continue to monitor sites is extraordinary. And he posts very regularly to the Directorate General of Antiquities and Museums website. So they try to keep, to the extent possible, a running flow of information. Enterprises like UNESCO's bodies, and UNESCO has mounted, for instance, a very robust campaign to try and monitor sites in Syria and to train those still in Syria to the extent possible. There's another group, the American Schools of Oriental Research, who have been mounting a program funded by the US government to monitor via satellite instances of looting. So I think people are using technology and information to the extent possible in conflict zones, but realistically in those areas, there's not much one can do except hope that the conflict ends sooner rather than later. I'm sorry, with the light, I can't see if a hand went up or not, but yes?
Are there any sites that don't want to be nominated?
If sites don't want to be nominated, they generally don't reach very far into the process. So you don't have to be a site owner to nominate. So there are sites that come forward to us where the site owner might be unhappy that it's reaching the watch. But since it's a voluntary process, and anybody can nominate to the watch, generally, once it reaches the watch, sort of review stage, if there's an issue, it's already been brought to our attention and we've dealt with it. I think that it's reflected in the nominations, really. So there are countries that are frequently underrepresented on the watch simply because we don't receive nominations from those places.
I just want to elaborate a little bit on that question. Our watch panels do take their own views about what it's appropriate to have on the watch and what is not appropriate to have on the watch. And they tend to discourage the inclusion of sites that are very, very well known, that are only in need of looking for more money or launching some kind of campaign that they'd like to promote through the World Monuments Watch. And so those sites which may be worthy of more recognition and more promotion sometimes don't make it. It's the ones that seem the neediest that the panel tends to respond to.
Thank you, Bonnie. I think we'll take one more question, if there is one. Yes?
You know what, I was curious about the site in Albania. I mean, it's not the type of thing you normally think of when you think of cultural heritage. But, I mean, places like the concentration camps have been recognized by history, but this is something more recent from the 60s. Is that the first type of site WMF has recognized, and can you say a little bit more about that?
No, on a previous watch list, one of the Gulag sites was on. And I think that Spach Prison, isn't cultural heritage in the way we normally think about it, but it very fully represents a chapter in history in Albania. And sites of conscience are not always easy for us to understand as heritage sites. But I think that what people fear, particularly with what's going on in the world today, is that we can't only celebrate the high points of history, we have to in some way embrace recognizing the difficult periods of history as well. And I don't know that it's necessarily the case that a site like Spach Prison can be saved, but I think the nomination demonstrated very strongly that there's local desire to see some recognition for a complicated period of recent history. Okay, well, thank everybody for coming. Please stay around if you have questions. Those of us on the staff and nominators in the audience would be happy to speak with you one-on-one. Thank you very much.